Thank you very much, conference organizers. I must say it's a very big pleasure for me to be here, to participate in this conference. Very big pleasure indeed, and I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me. All protocol observed. Permit me therefore to begin by saluting the efforts of the organizers of this series of webs, the efforts of all the stakeholders. I sincerely believe, like the organizers, that this great awakening to the nefarious efforts of sexual violence and the need to put in place policies to prevent it, to restore the dignity of the victims, and to, make sure that this terrible phenomenon does not occur anymore, needs to be sustained. And I believe this is what is being done with the series of webinars that have been going on so far. Thank you once more for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. Sexual violence can be defined as physical or psychological violence out through sexual offenses that targets sexual attempted molestation, sexual slavery, being forced to forcing things through the genitalia or the anus, forced marriages, early marriages, mutilating people's genitals, sexual slavery, or sexual servanthood to combatants. I totally appreciate the efforts that scholars and human and women rights activists have made to ensure that this issue is placed on the agenda of international organizations. Nonetheless, a closer reading shows that there are some aspects of this same issue, the issue of sexual violence and women's human rights, that needs to be looked into with some more detail. But before we get to that, perhaps I could just mention that violence against women inevitably makes them vulnerable and tend to feel victimized. This victimhood status has mental and psychological repercussions, not only on the women victims, but also and more especially on their immediate families, on their entourage, and on the society as a whole. It is therefore very important for African societies and nations to decipher and put in place mechanisms, laws, and policies which could guard against violence against women, minimize the effects and trauma of sexual violence, defend the victims, and protect the human rights of women. Violence against women and women's rights violations must therefore be given the attention that they deserve in discussions of human rights, and there must be a will to enforce, these policies. The theme of this third forum, the theme of this third forum of the series of webinars entitled "Sexual Violence Issues and Women's Human Rights in Africa" is thus of a great allure, because it comes at a time when Africa is licking the wounds that have accrued from years of civil war in many countries, years of genocides in some and general political upheavals in others. As has been stated, women remain the real victims of turmoil in states and nations in which there is upheaval. The restoration of their human dignity after episodes of sexual violence generally becomes, therefore, a cause for concern involving not only concerted national action, but also the alliance of the international community. I therefore, once more, salute the organizers of this webinars, and because they have not only awakened to this great need, but have also sought to awaken the rest of the world. Like I said earlier, a lot has been done already to sensitize and to place this issue in the agendas of international organizations like the UNDP, the UN Security Council, UN Women, UNIFEM, and the World Bank, and many others. It is that needs some investigation. There is, for instance, or the private, the secrecy about the issue of male rape continues to place women at a disadvantage. Finally, we will notice through this discussion that the recording and the remembering of rape against women has not quite been effected in African countries. And this hampers the enunciation and implementation of policies, to stop this phenomenon. Now, rape has always been regarded as a byproduct of war and conflicts. In some countries and some international organizations, it is considered as something which is inevitable, something which cannot be controlled, because it emanates from the uncontrolled sexual urges of soldiers who have been deprived of family warmth for a very long time, being at the war front. However, very recent thought about war and sexual violence seems to argue that sexual violence is not really an unavoidable phenomenon. It is rather considered as an aspect of a political strategy to weaken victims, to weaken opponents by destroying the valued aspect of women's, sexuality, which is their purity. We'll look at that later on. Whatever the matter, whatever the case, the underlying fact is that women are raped during war. Women are traumatized during war. They are made to be servants to the combatants. They are used as sexual slaves. And this trauma has an effect not only on the victims, but on the entire society. It is therefore incumbent on African societies to find ways of extirpating this phenomenon. It is incumbent on governments to put in place strategies and policies that can render women freer, render women capable to experience their own human rights, even in times of war. But the aspect that concerns us more in this paper is the aspects of rape that are made invisible. And one of these aspects is the rape of women in the private sphere. When rape is conducted in the public sphere of war and diplomacy, it is considered a crime, which is punishable by law. And this punishment arises from a UN resolution of 2008, because such a crime is considered as a crime against humanity and sometimes as genocide. But when rape is carried out in the private sphere of home and domesticity, it seems to be overlooked. It is this situation which is worrisome. It is this situation which has not been given the appropriate attention and which we wish to bring to the fore in this presentation. We contend that when rape is not well attended to, rape that happens in the private sphere, we contend that it is as a result of gender socialization, in which women's roles, in which a woman is not considered as something very important. Women matters concerning the women are considered a sphere, and therefore rape. We find this worrisome, and we intend to call the attention of policymakers even to this situation. We think that the breakdown of society into the private and the public spheres, and the restriction of women to the private sphere enhances and propagates atrocities like rape, and creates the social relations of power and control between men and women, and therefore continue to perpetuate the conditions necessary for rape. It is this privatization, I beg your pardon, it is this privatization that makes women silent, even when they suffer the trauma of rape, because it is considered a private affair. It is sometimes regarded with stigma and sometimes not quite punished in the law. Another form of sexual violence, which necessitates a deeper, more detailed attention, is the rape of men. It is becoming quite evident that not only women suffer rape, but that males also suffer rape. Boys and men suffer rapes, especially during wartime experiences. Examples abound among the refugees fleeing from the civil war in Congo, and it'd be possible to look at some of the pictures of this phenomenon. If you were to read my entire paper, I'm not sure it's possible right here, and the time scope is not good enough. It is a phenomenon. Permit me to just present a picture of a Cameroonian woman who was a wardress in charge of prisoners, but who was adopted from her duty post, swindled to the bushes, tortured, stripped naked, penetrated into her private parts with guns and shot right into her private parts with guns, and then assassinated, killed. This, was a typical case of the rape of women during wartime. The rape of men during wartime can be read, as I've said in my paper. It is a story of a young man who was a student in the University of Congo, but whose father was suspected of collaborating with the warriors and was killed. As he fled from the war, he was also abducted and was kept in a refugee camp, kept in the camp of the warriors, of the terrorists, where he was being raped continuously. These stories abound, and they need attention. They need our attention because when the rape of men is underlooked, this continues to falsify the narrative about sexual violence. It continues to make women feel as the ultimate victims. Meanwhile, there are male victims as well. And if male rape is highlighted, women's human rights are upheld. Women feel the equality that they need to feel with all of humanity. Women don't continue to feel as if they are the naturally gendered components of society, as if they are the natural victims, and as if they are the underside of society or the order of the man who is considered as the norm. So ignoring male rape actually does not only neglect the men, but it also harms women by enforcing a viewpoint that negates female, or that equates female with victimhood. In this way, women's human rights to honor, dignity, and reputation are dispensed with. I'd just like to show you a picture of a man who was raped. and how, because of the rape, he feels terribly disgusted with life, feels terribly traumatized. He can't have sex with his wife. He can't have sex because he had rape wounds, which he keeps trying to treat in hiding. But if male rape was, brought into the public sphere, brought into the limelight, men will take care of themselves. Organizations concerned with sexual violence will take care of the men as well. But when male rape is made a secret, men suffer unduly, and they are not taken care of. The third thing I'd like to talk about in this on this topic of some aspects of sexual violence which have not been considered quite well is the recording and the remembering of violence against women. We know very well that memory aids action. Recording and remembering violence against women is therefore a crucial strategic tool for ending the sexual violence that is perpetrated against women, a strategic tool for enhancing women's economic empowerment, for bringing about gender equality, and for increasing women's leadership and participation. When violence against women is recorded, remembered, and used in enacting policies, long-lasting peace and sustainable development can accrue. This then is followed by better health for women, better economic productivity, and the observance of their rights, which in the long run leads to social cohesion. Remembering is action, and forgetting is complacency. In Africa, it's easy to forget, not because women don't feel the pain of sexual violence, but because gender socialization is constructed within a complex matrix of the intersection between political, sociocultural, and economic factors which inform norms and attitudes. Norms and attitudes concerning gender, therefore, are a result of a socialization that makes women feel like they must be subservient to men, makes men feel that they are the dominant type, they are the all-powerful, and they are in control. This state of affairs continues to undermine women's emancipation, and it continues to undermine the observance of women's human rights and even sustainable development. It is possible to find data about sexual violence against women in international journals, in the international space. In 2016, for example, the UNDP report of human development in Africa noted that Africa has an alarmingly high rate of violence against women, and that this is based principally on societal norms which stereotype women's inferiority. We see that this is a sociocultural socialization which promotes violence against women. They are taught to be socially and economically inferior. Economically, a study was carried out in Tanzania, still in the 2016 UNDP report on Africa, and reveals that 43% of women in serious earn revenue than their peers. So when economic productivity for women goes down, they suffer violence. This lays more emphasis on economic factors at work which cause violence on women. Statistics from the World Bank also show that the phenomenon of violence against women is still very much ingrained in the strategy of the World Bank on Gender 2016 to 2033, I beg your pardon. We note that 46% of women in Africa have experienced one form of gender violence or another. In 2020, in 2016, the World Bank report entitled Women, Enterprise and the Law was a study carried out in 173 countries, that there are 943 differences in the treatment of men and women with regards to the law and access to economic opportunities. In some places, it even finds that there is a law which obstructs women's capacity to engage in economic enterprise. These cultural, political, and economic barriers against women's emancipation continue to put them in a disadvantaged position to men and help in fostering continuous gender discrimination. Discrimination means violation of women's human rights. But worse still, this goes seemingly unnoticed, unrecorded, and then not well disseminated for intervention. African countries continue to suffer the lack of a well-defined, significant, comprehensive, systematic, and nationally owned data collecting strategy. In Cameroon, for instance, women are still subordinated and subservient to men. They are considered weaker mentally and physically, and considered not appropriate for leadership or for business. The men operate in the public sphere and engage with politics, business, and high professionalism, while the women are relegated to the private sphere of domesticity, reproduction, family nurturance, and even though the situation has changed a bit, a lot still needs to be done. This research carried out in Cameroon, research for this paper was carried out at the Cameroon's Ministry for the Promotion of Women and the Family. And it shows that violence against women exists. In the yearly statistical yearbook of the ministry, many cases of violence are recorded, but these cases show a marked underestimation of the situation because they haven't been carried out through a logical survey. Rather, the said data was collected very haphazardly through police reports or reports of victims to the police, reports of victims in the hospitals, and reports of victims to the women promotion centers. When we realized that in a society where women are not supposed to be heard, where they are not supposed to carry out matters of their home into the public sphere, very little is being reported. Therefore, the data is haphazard and non-randomized. Countries in the African region have not conducted surveys specifically designed to collect data on violence on women in all its dimensions. Instead, the data has traditionally been collected using reproductive health surveys, crime and victimization surveys, and a multiple indicator cluster survey and policy statistics. The interplay of violence against reporting in the cases of violence results in the marginality of the data collected. Hence, to get more precise data on prevalence rates, causes, women's experiences of violence, and the consequences for them and their families, it is more important to implement surveys that specifically focus on violence on women and young girls, because the data on these surveys provide critical information for the design of intervention. Such data will help to challenge entrenched views of women's silence and acceptance of violence. It will highlight the intergenerational nature of abuse and intergenerational transfer of abuse, and it will also shape the understanding of the consequences of violence and how women cope with them. Without this data, therefore, it will be very difficult to target intervention that will effectively respond to the actual reality of women's experience of violence. Perhaps it would be good at this point to make some recommendations for a better fight against violence against women and a better enhancement of women's human rights in cases where sexual violence prevails against them. It would be also better to state that continental response to putting in place policies will do far much better than national response. And continental response could be helped by two factors. The first is that there's only one variable in violence against women in Africa, and that variable is that the degree of violence varies from one country to another, but violence against women, sexual violence, is a reality, is a truth, is a fact of women's everyday lives in Africa. Secondly, we can look at the commonalities that can help continental response to putting in place policies to extirpate violence against sexual violence against women. In common, African countries or African women are never more disadvantaged than men. In common, it will be rare to find an African country in which African women are more advantaged than men. It will be very rare. Also, African societies are gender sensitive, yet their laws are gender neutral. Continental response will take this into consideration for putting in place better policies and laws. Finally, economic and social stress, especially with COVID and the pandemic of COVID, exponentially increased gender violence. And this will be important in putting in place a continental plan of action and strategy to fight sexual violence against women. But countries could also individually enforce laws by considering the following recommendations. One, that they could use pre-existing national child protection programs and adapt targeting methodologies to ensure that women who have been sexually violated are taken care of. They could put cash in women's hands through stimulus or insurance schemes. Also, they could extend social protection to informal workers, workers in houses who work as house helps and baby nurses, office cleaners, restaurant owners and bar owners, and those who work in the informal sector have the propensity to experience more sexual-oriented violence. Financial support needs to target hard-hit women-led enterprises and businesses in feminized sectors with subsidized and state-backed loans. State-backed loans help women to take loans without having to pay heavy interest. We can also design domestic violence shelters or hotlines and make them essential services by increasing resources to them, groups to be at the front line of response. Nations could also expand the capacity of shelters for victims of violence by repurposing other spaces, such as empty hotels and educational institutions in this time of the COVID pandemic. Crisis task forces, emergency responses and teams, interagency committees could also work, and in their work, they could have equal representation of women and men as a measure to increase gender-responsive decision-making. Nations could also implement a proper population-based survey, which is systematic and comprehensive, to assess the prevalence and insistence of sexual violence, and this will allow a better policy formation. Finally, it will be important to include women in policy making because it is they who know how the shoe fits and where it pinches. It will be difficult for nations to work single-handedly. They could work with non-governmental organizations and international organizations. And for that, they could consider recommendations as follows. They could improve sensitization and information mechanisms. They could improve the physical and mental health of the population. They could do action-oriented research by scholars and other researchers. They could recommend actions to protect women's rights. And they could plan to draw national action plans and commitments related to women, peace and security, and include women's civil society organizations in the planning processes. In conclusion, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, government's inability to keep viable records and statistics on violence against women in Africa results in their inability to vigorously persecute perpetrators of the phenomenon. A more comprehensive, regular, and systematic data collection and recording will have to give a clear picture of the incidence and the prevalence of this phenomenon through either a population-based survey showing, on the one hand, the type, nature, and scope of the most common form of violence, and on the other hand, an administrative service-based data collected report or the sectorial resources stating whether or not the responses produced are meeting the needs of those who have experienced violence. In order for peace and security to return, sexual violence against men cannot continue to be kept a secret. It should be brought into the limelight so that men and women can feel that they are each other's keeper and that they are equal. Similarly, violence should be prosecuted, whether it occurs in the private or in the public sectors. Gender mainstreaming should be an essential process when enacting policy to combat sexual violence. In addition, rapid gender assessments, the focus on women in situations of vulnerability, should be conducted as soon as possible. These domestic violence shelters, our hotlines, should be identified as essential services, not optional services, and not incidental in the fight against violence against women. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I know there'll be lots of questions, and I'm ready for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mutia.